I had this friend back in the 2000s. We were friends since elementary school, all through middle school, and right up until our senior year of high school. I'm pretty sure we still would have been friends now, except she died. I'm sorry to be blunt, but it's still very raw for me. And I'm writing into you both as a cautionary tale and to raise awareness for what I personally believe happened to my friend, who I'm just going to call Sally. Sally and I are kind of stoners in high school. I won't sugarcoat it. We performed well academically, so I guess the teachers and our parents just turned a blind eye. But we smoked a decent amount of pot, and Sally would have really gotten a kick out of it becoming legal just after her death. Thanks, Obama. No, really. Now anyways, one day, Sally came to me very excited. She heard about this new, no, this is read as very old, drug, and it was like weed but way stronger. And better than that, it was totally and completely legal. She produced the biggest baggie of weed-looking substance I'd ever seen in my life, but it was a darker, spikier bud than what I was used to. Now, it turns out darker is a great description for salvia. Maybe it's not the case that everyone has a similar experience, but everyone I've spoken to has. I smoked a regular joint of salvia, assuming that was the right way, as did Sally. And the high, if you can even call it that, only lasted about 45 minutes. Let's just call it a trip instead. And during that one single experience on salvia, I believed I was God, and then the devil. And at one point I knew I had superpowers, but I dare not use them. I could tell where Sally was sitting, on my couch, but I couldn't see her. She was semi-invisible, kind of like when the Predator cloaks himself in those movies. And it was like the light was refracting around my friend. The posters on my bedroom wall changed into things I can't remember, nor do I even really want to, and I felt both powerless and godlike at the same time. And all this just from lying on my bed and looking up at the ceiling. Some of the stories I've heard or read from people who've taken salvia have been absolutely insane to me. You could do a whole video on terrifying experiences on salvia if only that actually fit your brand, but suddenly I was back to normal. And just like that, I was myself again, and it felt like nothing had happened. Unlike weed, where you feel the aftermath in various ways, the salvia was just sort of gone. Well, at least for me. And when I looked over at Sally, she was just beaming, staring into the middle distance with a blissful look on her face. Now, not to be crude, but it was like she'd just come down from some orgasm. Now, I sort of wondered if she was still tripping. But then she turned to me and I could see it was the same old Sally I knew and loved. And she said something I could never and would never agree with. "That was incredible, dude. I think we found our new drug of choice." Well, there was no way on earth that I was smoking that amount of salvia again. I did try, I really did. Sally was so enthusiastic about it, and something about it being legal made her feel different. As much as she'd been a bit of a pothead, she'd always despised the fact that it was illegal. She'd always hated the fact that we'd had to acquire it from ex-high schoolers who were almost all creeps, and I don't blame her. We both had some bad experiences with dealers from our high school and a bit older, and yeah, I don't really want to talk about those, though. But salvia, you could buy, legally, right from the sources. And there were stores tucked down these small alleys that sold it, and something about this spoke to Sally, I guess. And I guess it helped her have a better experience with the trip. And so, like I said, I tried. I really did. I mixed a tiny, tiny bit of salvia in with some rolled up cigarettes. Only I didn't smoke tobacco, so it was like throat effing myself with a lit cigar. I tried mixing it into some brownie mix, and it just tasted like eating brownies with dried leaves in it, and still made me trip in the worst ways. I ground it up and snorted it. Now that was a big mistake. I just sneezed it right out, and that was a gross experience. I don't even want to imagine that one. Now meanwhile, Sally was smoking more and more of what I genuinely believed to be Satan's drug of choice. I had no idea how she was even managing 2, 3, 4 joints of salvia a day without going insane. But I guess that's the problem, isn't it? She was. I just didn't see it. We were in our final year of high school studying for finals and graduation despite what else the salvia might have been doing. It was turning Sally into this sort of savant genius, believe it or not. She went from a B student to an extremely high straight A student in every single one of her classes. The teachers were shocked. If she'd gone through her whole high school career like this, she would have been valedictorian so hard that it would have left the previous one in the dust. As it was, she was on track to comfortably be salutatorian. Now, alas, she never made it. It's a tale as old as time, but with a dark, modern mystery twist. At least, in my opinion, it is. Obviously, the drugs got to her, but salvia doesn't get to you in the same way most other drugs do. There are other natural plants that have a lot in common with salvia, but nothing I've ever read about these other drugs have been quite as cursed and haunting as my own experience on that drug, let alone what Sally must have gone through. It started when she came to our shared room in our shared student accommodation one day and announced to me that she'd seen God under a bridge. I assumed she was joking, so I asked if God was under the bridge and if she was so sure it was God and not some homeless troll. Now, Sally got kind of, not mad, but serious about this. God hadn't been under the bridge. She'd been under the bridge when she saw God. I asked her to explain how this meant that God themselves wasn't under the bridge, and she told me a story of how, of course, she'd been smoking salvia with some other kids who'd been introduced to the legal substance. And did I emphasize that this crap is legal? By someone, and I'm pretty sure it was Sally, but I didn't want to upset her, and I could hardly accuse her too hard of introducing some kids to some legal plant. Now, she explained that God had just appeared inside her head during a short trip, and he told her to cross over in the land of the goddess Sonora. Now, at first I didn't understand what Sally was saying. Cross over into where? What? Some kind of spiritual plane? And then it struck me with a dawning horror. She was talking about the Sonoran Desert, but with some kind of spiritual nickname her salvia-induced god had told her. We lived just outside of Phoenix to the southwest, so passing into the Sonoran Desert wasn't at all out of the question. In fact, a bunch of us had taken a camping trip to the outskirts until I realized that getting sand in a certain part of your body is one of the most unpleasant experiences I've had up until that point. I'm sure there are ways that older, seasoned women avoid that in the desert, but I was a 16-year-old high school kid. I had no idea. All I knew was as soon as I got home, I spent so long in the shower that I'm pretty sure my whole abdomen turned into a prune. Now, the point is, the potential for sand in her unmentionables aside, I didn't want Sally crossing over into the Sonoran Desert on some salvia-fueled pilgrimage. I protested and insisted that there's absolutely no way Sally should go on a pilgrimage to meet the goddess Sonora, or any other god for that matter. Unfortunately, I could not talk her out of it, no matter how much I rationalized, then begged, cried, screamed, threatened to tell her parents, threatened to handcuff her to her bedpost, all sorts of stuff. And so instead, I made the best compromise I could think of. I offered to go with her, and maybe this story would be very different if she'd said yes. Better or worse, I can't say, but again, she was absolutely adamant that this was something that she had to do alone because God had told her so. She laid out a plan. 1 week from now, she'd head to a certain rock that she'd seen in the vision, whereupon Sonora would be seated and grant her, quote-unquote, the truth, whatever that was. Honestly, the trip didn't seem too bad. If she was careful, she could manage it in a day. I was more concerned when she said the communion with Sonora had to occur at night because the deserts get so cold at night, your nipples feel like they're going to explode, but whatever. She could wrap up warm, and I still had a week to try and talk her out of this madness. Now, I should have seen it coming. When I woke up the next morning, Sally was gone. She'd left a note on her pillow that read, "I'm sorry. God would have wanted it this way." Now, the real sucky thing is that I couldn't drive at the time. I'd never passed my tests, and I had no sensible way of following Sally into the desert. I should have called a friend, but frankly, we'd alienated anyone that I trusted enough with all of this, and I had finals to go study for. Now, I should have made much more of an effort to follow her and catch up with her, even though I'm sure that she left hours before I woke up. Regardless, I will never forgive myself and stop beating myself up for the fact that I could have done more. Sally didn't come home that night. She didn't come home the next day either, or the next. I reported her as a missing person. But despite being in high school, she was 18. She'd left an indication that she'd gone on some vacation, and it was only my word that she'd claimed that she'd be back in a day. I tried to point out that she'd gone out into the desert. I tried to draw on as much research as I'd been able in the days before Google that showed how many people died out there every year. Now, I felt like I was getting through to law enforcement. They promised to send some ranger out to scout out the route that Sally had told me about, and then I made the mistake of mentioning salvia and visions, and saw their eyes glaze over, and at that point I think I lost them. A week passed, and then two. You'd think that Sally's parents would be frantic at this point too, but here's the thing. Her dad abandoned the family when Sally was 2. Her brother was a 23-year-old stoner who was far more of a hot mess than Sally ever was, and I had no idea how to get a hold of him. And Sally's mom had died when we were in middle school. She really had nobody else, really, and I can kind of see why she wanted to find answers and visions and gods. Eventually, there was a knock on my dorm room door. Sally's car had been found. It appears as if it had been there for a couple of weeks, based on the layer of sand covering it. Now, the rangers and law enforcement were taking it seriously. I insisted that I go with them, that maybe something would jog my memory about the route that she was taking, the rock on which she claimed Sonora would appear. And oh God, I wish I hadn't. And I'm glad I did, but I just wish that I hadn't. I was the one who found her. She was lying in the shade of a 10-foot-high rock, her body half covered in sand by this point, and she was wearing only her underwear, and appeared that she'd neatly folded her clothes beside her before lying down and just slipping away. The official cause of death was exposure to the elements. Sally had somehow, through months of slow salvia-induced psychosis, become convinced that gods were communicating with her. Later, we even found journals in which she claimed Sonora was the goddess of the desert who bestowed power through suffering, thirst, and hunger. And I could never find any actual mythological record of this. It just seemed like something Sally had hallucinated. And so that's a horrible story. It's scary how things can mess with your mind, and maybe my mind's messed up too, but I think things were a lot worse. I don't think Sally actually died of the elements. I think she was murdered. I think somehow someone had been implanting the salvia psychosis into her mind through suggestion. I have no idea who. Someone she got high with when I wasn't around, maybe. And I'll tell you why I think this. Sally wore a locket with 2 photos, one of her mother shortly before she died and one of the pair of them when Sally was a baby. She never removed that locket. Never. Not when she slept, not when she showered, not when she bathed. She could be completely naked and she'd still be wearing that locket. Not only had she removed it for whatever reason she removed her clothes, but there was no sign of the locket anywhere. It wasn't placed with her clothing like the rest of her belongings, and it wasn't in the car. I told law enforcement about this over and over again, but they insisted that there was no other evidence of foul play. They said the locket could have easily sunk into the sand or all sorts of things. Nobody murdered her, they said, and sure, maybe someone didn't stab or shoot her or crush her trachea, but someone sent her out there to die, and then they took that locket. I'm certain of it. I've been out there so many times searching for it. I've dug, I've searched with metal detectors, and I've once even smoked salvia again against my better judgment, hoping for some type of vision or a map or a culprit or something. I don't know. Maybe Sally had it right. Just lie down and drift away. I'm the one left here still obsessing over this for nearly 20 years, and I don't go out there much anymore, but I can't really leave Phoenix. What if, like the namesake bird, Sally rises from the ashes and shows me who killed her? What if one day I go out there and find the locket? At least I could be at peace. Instead, I'm just sort of left here writing the story, begging people not to go down the salvia path. It's still a legal substance in Arizona, and I don't say this in a sort of winners don't do drugs type of way. It's just the idea of what happened to Sally and what might have happened is enough to terrify me for the rest of my life. I wish I could let go, but I can't. And I hope sending this email to you brings some closure, and thank you for reading. Sally, rest in peace. I've always loved you forever, and you might not have met God, but you're the closest thing to a goddess to me, and I don't need to smoke salvia to know that. So I've been asked to write into you by a younger friend who's a listener. I hope you get a kick out of this one. Apparently you do like bat crap crazy people. Now, a bunch of years ago, after the dawn of cell phones, but before the rise of smartphones, me and a bunch of buddies decided to go on a little trip. We've been dreaming of this trip since college, talking about it a bunch and never actually doing it. And so one summer, I was all, guys, F this. We're doing it. We're doing a road trip across the states, and nothing can stop us now. Now, we're all from sunny California and all went to the same college there, so it was just a case of seeing the country we so love. And there was no real rhyme or reason to our route. We just plotted out a vaguely cool-looking trail that would take us to all the places that we'd always wanted to visit, or drive through, or pass by with a sort of look of disgust. I won't lie, the four of us were kind of comfortably off. One of us was, and still is, disgustingly rich, but also the most generous pal you'd ever meet. So he offered to fund the majority of the trip, with the rest of us chipping in for food, touristy stuff, roach-infested digs that we might stay in, that kind of thing. But our rich buddy, whose name honestly is Rich, paid for the vehicle, the gas, the upkeep, and he bought a brand new car for the trip, actually. And it was an absolutely stunning Camry, and to say that I was jealous would be an understatement. Now, a slightly buff silver, this thing was a beast. It maybe wasn't the best choice for a road trip. We would have probably been better off getting a van or a camper or something, but we just wanted to drive the American highways looking cool as we did. Now, there were four of us, and the Camry was comfortable, if intimate and crowded, and that was fine with me, given who the group members were. There was Rich, his boyfriend Andy, and then there was me, of course, and finally there was Kay. Now, I've had a huge crush on Kay since the first year of college and never made a move. We just graduated at the start of summer when we went on that road trip, for some context. Now, naturally, while we all took turns driving, the majority of the trip was Rich handling his brand new Camry and Andy riding shotgun, and this meant that I got to spend hours, days really, in the backseat of a car with a girl that I believed was the love of my life. And it's pretty obvious to anyone on the outside that I've been thoroughly friend-zoned, but bear with me. What is love without hope, and what is hope without being a hopeless romantic loser like myself? This is why my British friends call me a wanker, I guess. No, anyway, it was brilliant. We spent the days driving, sightseeing, and hitting all the tourist traps that sheltered Californian kids typically look down upon. And then we spent the days in a mixture of high-quality hotels, but more often, these flea-ridden desert motels. Now, I couldn't have been happier. It was freaking epic. We passed through a bunch of deserts on our routes. One of our big things, mostly thanks to Andy, who was a geology nerd, was that we wanted to experience as many types of desert as possible, if you understand what I'm saying. A lot of people think deserts are just sand and red dust, but that's not even slightly the case. Did you know most snowfields are technically deserts? Huge areas of just shingles, all sorts of stuff. Now, most salt flats are also deserts, which I think is a more commonly known fact, but it's the Utah Salt Flats, the Great Salt Lake Desert, where this first started. If you've never been, in my opinion anyway, Utah is an absolutely stunning state. The Salt Flats, the Salt Lake Desert, it's a miracle of nature. There's just something about it, something haunting and beautiful about it all. The Bonneville Salt Flats were like a spiritual experience for me, especially experiencing it with Kay. I was growing convinced that I might not be in the friend zone after all. And at one of the motels, there had only been 2 double rooms available. Kay was the one who suggested she and I share, and nothing happened between us, but she wasn't particularly shy in walking out of the shower wrapped in a towel. You know, the kind of thing that makes a naive young man think that she might have a crush when really it's a huge friend zone red flag. But oh well, not the point. Well, it is and does sort of relate, but let's not get ahead of ourselves. Now, we spent maybe too long exploring the deserts of Utah. The sun was beginning to set as we trekked back to the car, ready to head to our next rest stop destination. A few miles down the road, and we spied a car pulled onto the verge. Unpleasant-looking black smoke was billowing out from under the hood, and an extremely red-faced man was pacing back and forth behind the car, as if hoping the desert plains would offer up some answer. We slowed and pulled up behind him. No way were we leaving a fellow traveler alone on the road, especially knowing how cold it could get even in the summer. And that's another thing about deserts. Most of them get extremely cold at night, you might know, apart from the frozen tundra ones, of course. They're just cold, period. And so, the road we were traveling wasn't entirely void of other travelers, but it wasn't exactly bustling with traffic either. Most of the other drivers seemed to be vacationers or road trippers like us. It wasn't exactly a route that you took to and from work, which in retrospect could have been a red flag, and you'll see why. When we pulled up on the verge behind Angry Breakdown Man, you could almost see the relief fill his body. We all climbed out of the car, but Rich did the talking. He had a bit of a gift of gab. It turns out that the Angry Breakdown Man was named Cliff, and he'd been traveling home from work when something just sort of exploded under his hood. Now, he knew nothing about cars, so he just had to stand there and watch as thick black smoke billowed out from under the hood of his red Ford. Rich did know about cars, and he knew enough to try and pop the hood would be a bad idea right now. Whatever was going on, it looked like it might actually catch fire any minute, and he suggested that Cliff climb in with us, and we'd ride the 3 to 4 hour trip to the motel that we booked, and he could sort his own stuff out from there. Now Rich, ever the kind guy he is, told Cliff not to worry about costs and things for the time being. Kay climbed into the back of the Camry, and I moved to sit next to her, in the middle, of course, and before I had a chance, Cliff practically dived in my way and scrambled next to Kay. Kay shot me a look that suggested that she wasn't entirely comfortable about this, but what could we say? And let me tell you a little something about this Cliff. He was dressed in what seemed like business attire, but he ditched his suit jacket and tie back of the car. He hadn't bothered to retrieve these, and I could see a dusty suit jacket abandoned on the floor. I guess it wasn't a tailored fit, or maybe work paid for his clothes, I don't know, I'm not an office worker. Now, he was also a fella who was on the larger side. It was impossible for myself and Kay to sit in the back of that Camry next to him without being touched by his sweaty body. And boy, did he sweat. The damp patches under his arms were more like waterfalls than puddles, and even in Rich's air-conditioned, wonderful car that he had, Cliff didn't seem to be cooling down at all. Sweat was just pouring down his face, and I wouldn't normally be this mean about someone's appearance, but I think it's justified here, and I'm sure you'll soon see why. Things were a little awkward at first. Cliff decided to talk about himself relentlessly even when we stopped asking, and the stories he told were similar but weirdly conflicting. One moment he was a salesman who worked out of an office in Salt Lake City. The next he was a traveling salesman, hence why he'd been on that stretch of road. Now he hinted that he was part of the LDS Church, a Mormon you might know them as, but seemed to know nothing about the faith. He claimed that he had a wife and referred to them as being together, but later said that they were separated. One story he did consistently stick to, though, was that he wasn't allowed to see his kids. He reassured us that this was because of his B-word of a mother-in-law and nothing he'd ever done wrong, but, you know, where there's smoke, pouring out of the hood of a red car no less, then there's fire. Now it's a shame this was in 2002 because he might as well have just claimed it was because, quote, they don't understand the things I say on Twitter. Now I think by this point Rich and Andy had tuned him out, leaving Kay and I to listen to Cliff's blabbering and blubbering. Now the real problematic moment came when his chubby hand rested, by accident, on Kay's bare thigh. She visibly reacted with a hell no, and Cliff acted horrified. He apologized, insisting that he hadn't been thinking, and that he meant nothing by it. I tried to defuse the situation by pointing out some natural beauty through the right window, and this allowed Kay a private moment to wipe Cliff's sweat from her skin without looking too rude, not that he deserved it. Now the next weird thing was Cliff blurting out that he believed you just entered an endless abyss of nothing when you die. We hadn't even been discussing a remotely similar topic. He just Sort of said it. I'm pretty sure that's not at all what Mormons believe, for one thing. But it was just such a dark, bleak thing to hear as the sun was vanishing over the horizon and the night was kicking in. I checked my watch, still an hour until we reached the rest stop. Cliff fell silent for a moment, then just said it again. An abyss. Yeah, that's what happens. That's what I think. Kay, in perhaps one of her funniest moments, suggested that we play I Spy to distract from Cliff's misery. Everyone else groaned except for Cliff, who just blurted out, "She's back there, you know? Back where I came from?" I asked him what he meant, and with this sudden burst of shocking venom, he said that he was talking about his ex-wife. I wondered if he meant that she was back in the nearest town or city, and that's where she lived with the kids. No. "I left her in the trunk," he said, or something along those lines. Andy, suddenly paying attention, asked the important question. Was she alive?" According to Cliff, she was not. Her decomposing body was in the trunk of his Ford, and had been so for some days. "I did it," he added. Well, holy hot salt, Batman. What were we to do? This guy had just outright claimed that his dead wife, who he had murdered, was sitting in a car we were driving him far away from. On one hand, we could just keep driving and get him to the rest stop before calling the cops. In the early 2000s, our brick Nokias most definitely didn't get reception out in the salt flats, and for all I know, it still is a cell phone dead zone out there. On the other hand, for all we knew, Cliff had a knife or a gun and a surprising propensity for in-vehicle violence. And the longer we drove with him, the more at risk we were. Kay, the genius, had already been working on a plan. Then she says, "Hey Greg, I forgot to show you this pamphlet for the world's biggest aubergine. Check it out." And then she reached past Cliff and handed me this pamphlet. Now I was confused at first until I looked through. Somehow she managed to scribble a few words inside. "Gonna ask to stop to pee. Kick him out." I replied telling Kay that the huge aubergine looked like a great time and we should visit, and that was her cue. She asked Rich to pull over so she could quickly take a pee in the salt desert, and Rich obliged. Kay climbed out of the car, clearly trying to keep calm, and I saw her step to the side. And then, in an act of heroic strength, I genuinely don't think I would have managed if I hadn't been trying to get into Kay's pants, I both shoved and kicked Cliff out of the open door. It somehow went perfectly. He went sprawling face first onto the asphalt, and Kay gave him a kick for good measure and dived back into the car and screamed at Rich to drive. He was peeling away before Kay even got the door closed. Kay and I looked out the back windshield while Rich and Andy checked the rearview mirrors, and what we saw chilled us to the bone. Cliff was spinning around, howling towards the sky, tearing his shirt off, and as he did so, we could see the old healed scars of something that looked like a pentagram on his back. We hightailed it to the rest stop, breaking the speed limit almost in the hopes that we'd get pulled over by cops so we could tell the story. No such luck, but we did call them as soon as we got to the all-night diner attached to the motel. We breathlessly recounted our story to the night waitress, who seemed to regard it with an almost bored acceptance, claiming that yeah, weird things happen around here sometimes. And the cops showed up a couple of hours later, which I guess you can't blame them for given the remote location. And they went looking for Cliff and told us to stay at the motel for a few nights until they got back in touch. And there was no sign of Cliff. They did find his Ford, which had been apparently deliberately torched. There was no murdered ex-wife in the trunk. Whether he went back and retrieved her, or he lied, or something else entirely, I have no idea. There were no reports of a missing person, especially anyone married to a guy called Cliff, and his existence was just some mystery. The cops theorized that the pentagram or whatever we saw carved into his flesh was some kind of leftover from the handful of true stories of satanic panic from the 80s. Some kids really did suffer from abuse masked by the satanic panic furor. Very few people are aware of that fact. Not all of it was actually made up. And so Cliff could have been anyone. He could have been a mentally ill victim of an abusive upbringing. He could have been a member of a 2000-style Manson family. He could have been a wife killer. But one thing he couldn't have been is a passenger on our road trip for any longer than he was, and I have no regrets about kicking that terrifying man to the curb, literally. But as one final sting in the tail, which I'm sure you've guessed, yes, Kay and I never got together. I wasn't her type, I assume anyways, and I had the guts to tackle a potential wife killer, but I still never got the courage to tell Kay how I felt about her. Oh well, if Cliff's marriage was true and any indication of married life, then maybe I'm better off staying as a single, eligible bachelor. I've got a very short but very creepy story for you, as when I was a little kid, I was obsessed with road trips. Every chance I'd get, I'd beg my mom or dad to take me for a drive. I particularly liked driving at night, and there was just something comforting about it, and still is. At first, Mom and Dad both seemed excited to acquiesce to my request, as they say in the Pirates of the Caribbean. It was like a family bonding exercise, but then it became just Mom or just Dad, and they'd both say no. Eventually, my parents split up. Now, I was only about 4 or 5 at the time, so I didn't really understand what was going on. But one night, there was a tapping on my window. Someone was throwing stones. I looked out, and Dad was down in the yard. He whispered me to be quiet and told me to sneak downstairs. Now, I didn't even need to change out of my pajamas, I thought. He had clothes ready for me and a warm coat. And it was time for a night drive, I thought. A big road trip to somewhere that I'd always wanted to go, Death Valley. And so we began the trip. From what I can remember, we kept to some back roads and stayed in the skeeviest motels. But I was with my dad, who I hadn't seen in months, and I was on a road trip, driving at night. It was my favorite. Now, eventually we were driving through the desert. It was wonderful, everything I dreamed of. Our headlights lit up the cacti and cow skulls and broken signs that we saw, and I imagined that I was some cowgirl in the Wild West. Dad called me his little cowgirl angel when I told him this, and then we pulled off the road and onto the sand. I wasn't sure where we were driving, but it was bumpy and I just didn't like it. Dad told me not to worry, that cowgirls didn't cry and that we were almost there. There was an empty clearing. Dad stopped the car and told me to wait in the passenger seat. He climbed out and went around to the trunk. Now, he spent some time there, and when he came back, he motioned for me to crank down my window. Now, when I did, he fed a little green hose pipe through and started tickling me with it. Now, this made me laugh a lot. He told me that we'd get to spend more time together, as much as we wanted, and what a perfect place to do it. Again, I didn't understand what he meant until many years later. Suddenly, there were sirens, and shouting, and yells that guns had been drawn. That hose pipe disappeared from the window, and the rest is just some insane blur. I was now in an ambulance, then I was in a hospital, and then Mom and my grandparents and my aunts and uncles kept coming to visit. Mom was crying a lot. I didn't see Dad, and I kept asking about him, and nobody would say anything. I asked if we were going back to Death Valley and that I wanted to see the desert again. Mom said maybe one day, but not yet. Now, years later, I found out the truth. Mom had full custody of me, and Dad wasn't allowed to see me at all. I still don't know why, and I'm not sure I really want to know. But he kidnapped me and took me out into the desert, and I'm sure you can imagine what would have come next given that hose pipe. Thankfully, Mom had noticed I was gone and called the cops. They put out some APB and on Dad's car, and the rest is history. Thankfully, I'm fine now. A little bit of therapy and a few night terrors is a small price to pay for surviving, and I'm just glad that Death Valley was a misnomer in this case, and I was able to continue living my life rather than ending up as one of the many bodies buried in that desert sand. Back in the late 90s, me and my buddy went exploring regularly in northern Greenland. We've always been the type to do the opposite of everyone else. Plan to do a tourist trek to a regular area? Not us. We're doing a desert made of snow and ice. It's a pretty popular area to visit for icy desert enthusiasts, but I don't claim to be some ice desert connoisseur. We just prefer the cold, and trust me, Greenland's one of the coldest places on Earth to visit. We're both trained guides for the area, and these days we take tourist expeditions out to plenty of safe spots. Back then, to learn the ropes and learn the limits of our body, though, we'd go on duo expeditions together. At first, we were a bit reckless and soon learned that you cannot treat nature without the respect it's due. Otherwise, you'd end up as one of the many thousands of corpses who have never found proper burials in frozen tundras or icy mountains. We specialize in exploring northern Greenland because it's one of the coldest places on Earth. There's almost no rainfall there, pretty much all the rain falls as snow. The weather conditions can be insane, and I would place a bet that we've had to cancel more expeditions than we've actually been on due to unsafe weather. This particular story takes place in the late 90s when we were both in our mid-20s. My buddy and I'll just call him Arnie, set off with a route in mind solely for the sake of taking it. No end goal, no real point. It just seemed like a good route to take there and back again, with some beautiful vistas for Arnie to capture on his camera, specifically designed for sub-zero conditions. We hiked for a few days, setting up the warmest and coziest tent we could possibly carry between the two of us. And like I said, Greenland's a pretty popular destination for reckless weirdos like us, so we passed a few other explorers on the way. One guy was dog sledding and even offered us a ride because we looked like we were struggling. Naturally, we turned him down. We explained that we had a couple snowmobiles tucked away safely some distance back, and we were using those to get around. On the fourth day, we left our snowmobiles at camp and went for a hike. To our surprise, we found a small cliff which hadn't been on any of the satellite photography. Now remember that even back in the late 90s, mapping parts of the world wasn't as advanced as it is now. It was way before Google Earth, and many areas of the off-beaten track would look like a blur in the footage that we were able to acquire. Now what was more surprising was discovering that the small mountain had a fairly obvious cave opening to it. Of course, we were going inside. It was still morning, so we had plenty of time. Ice caverns don't tend to be particularly dark, especially when they have a large opening like this one did, because the light refracts off the ice and keeps the place somewhat lit up. We brought some glow sticks and a flashlight each, but at first we didn't need them. What we saw caused both of our jaws to drop almost to the floor. There were carvings on the wall, similar to ancient cave paintings and various other archaeological finds we'd read up about during our degrees. These seemed to depict some strange things, though. There were rudimentary figures worshipping a large, bearded man on a throne who seemed to be twice their size. In another mural, the same figures were fighting a beast with spears. It seemed to be some kind of mammoth with tentacles, almost like a Lovecraftian creature, and certainly nothing ever recorded in the history books. There were a couple of more of these murals showing the small men fighting, and in some cases being decimated by chthonic creatures. And then the final mural was the oddest. It depicted the large bearded man who'd been sitting on the throne, but he was holding some kind of device, a very futuristic looking device. "Is that a Game Boy?" my buddy asked. Now it certainly looked like one. Almost immediately, though, our attention was caught by a dais on the far wall with an almost perfectly intact polar bear cub skeleton displayed there. However, instead of the normal canines one would expect to see in a young polar bear, the creature instead had walrus-like tusks. Again, this was not a creature that had been recorded in any sort of zoology book. Arnie and I began to get excited, very excited. It was possible that we'd stumbled upon the find of the decade, and this would change everything that we knew about ancient civilization. This would make us rich, and we would go down in history as two of the most important scientists the world had ever known. If only it hadn't been for that goddamn Game Boy in the final carving. "You like my art, huh?" The voice called out from the back of the cave in a different room. I recognized the accent immediately as Norwegian, and a man came staggering into the room, clutching an ancient-looking bottle of what I'm sure was some home-brewed moonshine of sorts. "Like my home, do you? Just walk in, do you?" And we began to profusely apologize. It didn't quite dawn on me then, but what we found was a very unconventional Germanic artist. None of these cave carvings were ancient secrets of mankind. None of those monsters were unknown beasts. They were this drunken Norwegian bestial's OCs, really, and there was a carving of him being worshipped by his minions. And then, for some reason, he'd carved a picture of himself playing a Game Boy, probably. What the horrible polar bear skeleton was, I have no idea. I guess he'd moved on to sculpture. We profusely apologized and began to slowly back away from the door. I say slowly because we noticed that in his other hand, the Norwegian was clutching what looked like one of those pistols from World War II. You know, the ones the Germans wielded, the Walther. "Maybe one of you will stay here," he said, very clearly looking at Arnie. According to the Norwegian artist, it got very lonely out in the caves, making his art. Maybe my friend Arnie would be a perfect companion for him, someone to warm his bed at night and warm his body too. Now, I'm not going to speak for Arnie, but I didn't think it sounded like an appealing prospect for him, and I wasn't ready to leave my friend to the mercy of a clearly drunk, clearly insane Norwegian. When the man threw his empty bottle against the wall, we both jumped in fear, and this Norwegian roared with laughter. His pistol was now trained on both of us. The Norwegian grunted that actually he was bored of us, and he was sure that he could find a much better companion. As his English grew more and more broken, he told us that we had 10 seconds to run before he ended us there and then and turned us into his latest art pieces. Me and Arnie had never ran so fast out of anywhere, ever. I have no idea if the Norwegian was even following us. I didn't even care. We did not stop running for 2 hours until we reached the camp and the snowmobiles, and by then we could at least see that he wasn't following us. We packed up camp and hightailed it out of there, riding those snowmobiles for 2 days without a break, and we only stopped to refuel. The adrenaline, the cold, and some substances we should not have had kept us awake. We got back to the nearest town and immediately reported everything to local law enforcement, but you know what they said? "Oh yeah, that's Lars. He can get a bit like that, he's a real character, but he's harmless though." They wouldn't even go out to speak to him. Now I still love Greenland. We live there and operate as tour guides for tourists who want to see the nice and safe parts of the country, but trust me, we don't take them anywhere near Lars's cave. And it was hard to tell how old he was. He could have been 80 or he could have been 28. In my opinion, he's still out there, carving his little weird drawings, and I guess it is a unique art in a way. The main thing I wondered, though, was whether he's upgraded from the Game Boy he carved himself playing, or if he's got a Nintendo Switch now. So I'm a true blue Aussie. I'm not ashamed to throw another shrimp on the Barbie. I have a beloved Ute, and Great Northern Super Crisp is my favorite beer. Contrary to what people believe, none of us like Foster's. Tastes like piss. It's made here, but it isn't drunk here. Super Crisp is where it's at. I love this country, I really do, but have you seen how incredibly massive it is? There's a ranch here that is literally bigger than Texas. And I did a bit of work there once. You have to travel by helicopter just to get to one part of the ranch from another. It's madness. And so I have this mate, an English fella, who moved to Oz when we were both young. His name is Malcolm, and Malcolm is as solid as they come. Now, he's a middle child, but he's gotten so sick of the jokes in early secondary school that he insisted on being called Malk, not Malcolm. And at first people ignored him. But then he had this huge growth spurt and became the hardest guy in our year, and nobody's messed with him then. Imagine a bunch of Aussie blokes being schooled by an English ponce named Malcolm. Christ, he better not listen to the story. He'll kick my butt 6 ways from Sunday if he hears me call him a ponce. I'm just a little wiry dude. I'm pretty sure I'd be a Wasteman Bogan if it wasn't for Malk. He's my rock. And speaking of rocks, this is where the story is heading. When we finished school, we'd always planned on taking a year or 2 or 3 to explore our wonderful country before we went back into education. And one of the places we'd both always longed to visit was Uluru, the Ayers Rock to you foreigners. It's a bloody majestic place it is. Photos don't do it justice, they really don't. In fact, it's actually easy to see photos of Uluru in books and get mixed up with totally different, smaller rocks. That is, if you're a dummy with no sense of direction and no Malk to guide you on the right path. But here's the bummer. Malk and I planned this epic adventure all throughout multiple years of school. We were both a fifth of the way into this planned expedition. We were going to play it by ear, but the final year was meant to just be, let's head wherever. And so we rented a nice hotel for our trip to Uluru. No, I'm just kidding. We actually stayed in the grodiest hostel that you can imagine, and I'm pretty sure that's how Malk got sick as a frickin' wild dog. Now, I won't go into details, but it was coming out both ends, if you know what I mean. And naturally, I was going to delay the trip to Uluru or cancel it altogether, but Malk then responds, "No, mate, you gotta go. It's bad luck if we change the plans. Go there for me, get some Bonzer photos, and if it really is as epic as they say, then we'll do a return visit on our way back cross-country." Well, I didn't need much persuading. I loaded up the ute with supplies, tossed in the spare single-man pop-up tent that we'd been carting around, and headed off on an adventure as Malcolm headed off for yet another trip to some grody bathroom. Poor guy. But in retrospect, the stomach bug probably did him one hell of a favor. So imagine a montage of me driving to Uluru in my ute, confident that I don't need a map or GPS because I guess I've memorized the route a million times, and imagine me reaching Uluru and feeling a little underwhelmed because it's a lot smaller than I was led to believe and a lot less vibrant. It was just kind of a big rock. I don't know what I was expecting, but in the moment I thought, I'm here now. I parked a bit of a distance away. I didn't want to disturb the tranquility with my loud-ass car, and then headed to Uluru on foot. Or at least I thought I did. Eventually I decided to check my map and my compass and realized that I somehow managed to go ass over tit and ended up in completely the wrong place. This wasn't Uluru, not at all. It really was just some underwhelming rock, and how I managed this I'll never know. Like I said, I'd be a waster bogan if it wasn't for Malcolm's influence in my life. My useless sense of direction meant that it took me a solid 3 hours to walk to the rock, which I've nicknamed Yoo-Hoo, and I kind of just wandered around the place, taking a few photos, imagining how Malk was going to rip the absolute feces out of me when I told him about this. But just then I heard this voice. Now, if I thought that I was a true-blooded Australian, this guy put me to shame. He was like every rough Australian survivalist stereotype thrown into one, having smoked 40 cigarettes a day to boot. And guess what? He was a survivalist. He wore a duster and one of those hats with the corks, which I genuinely thought only existed for tourists. But no, he told me later that they were an Aussie staple. Now we got to chatting and I explained that I was looking for and initially thought that I'd found Uluru, and he got my back up a bit when he called me a tourist, but this guy didn't seem like the kind of fella that you wanted to mess with, so I just laughed it off. I mean, to be fair, I had been an idiot. I told him where I'd parked the ute, and he just shook his head. Apparently, I'd gotten all turned around there too, and there was no way that I was getting back to the ute before dark. I'd left the tent and all my camping gear in that vehicle, thinking that there was no way that I was going to stay at this random rock overnight. And this survivalist told me that his name was Donegan, but his friends just call him Donnie. Now, I wasn't sure if this meant that I was allowed to call him Donnie or not, so I just called him Donegan, and he didn't correct me. He was a friendly fella. Now anyways, Donegan told me that there was no way that I'd get back to the ute before it got dark and freezing, and I'd almost definitely die and blah blah blah, but thankfully, he had a home not far from here. I was surprised because I hadn't seen any houses or shacks or anything like that. Now Donegan led me around the side of the rock and then climbed up a little, and he ushered me to follow him. And I was kind of amazed that by climbing up, you were able to see an opening in the rock face which led into a cave. We squeezed through, and I have to admit that I was impressed at the home Donegan had made for himself. He had a whole wall of shelves filled with battered paperback books, some fiction, some philosophy, all too intelligent looking for me, and he had another shelf filled with what seemed to be journals. One opening in the cave led to what appeared to be a bathroom with a seemingly full water tank for washing. Now, the other door had been sort of curtained off, and Donegan, in a surprisingly polite voice, asked me not to go in there because that was the kitchen, and a man's kitchen is his palace. I wasn't entirely sure that this was the saying, but whatever. Now, the sun was beginning to set now, and Donegan lit the fire pit in the center of his cave. Thankfully, the entrance was wide enough to let some of the smoke out, and he also bored a chimney through the rock so we didn't suffocate on whatever fumes we might have been cooking with. Donegan told me to make myself at home and particularly encouraged me to browse his shelves while he headed into the curtained-off kitchen to prepare our raw meal. He did kindly ask me not to read his journals, and again, he was weirdly polite about this. Now, I was starting to get the impression that the more polite Donegan's rule requests were, the more he would kick me in the wiener if I broke them. But reading another man's journal has never been something I've had a desire to do, not even the time Malcolm left his gay little therapy journal lying on the bed when I knew he had a crush on the girl I was seeing. Now anyways, I browsed through Donegan's books. I'd love to tell you the titles, but I can't remember them and I can't be bothered. I do remember he had a bunch of well-thumbed-through true crime books, some cookbooks, and one by that philosopher Nietzsche. Now, the next minute, Donegan's brushing through the curtain with two absolutely mouth-watering looking slabs of meat. Now, I was so hungry I could have eaten them raw there and then. He tossed an onion at me and told me to get chopping, pointing to a block by the fire. I did my best not to cry as I hacked up the onion. I've always been an onion crier, and I know Donegan gave me the onion just to make me weep. Now, all was forgiven once he started frying up the steaks. They both looked like 12-ounce mothers and the leanest meats I've ever seen. I tossed the chopped onions in the pan when Donegan commanded, and after a few minutes, he served up 2 steaks, medium rare. I expected him to be a rare steak or blue steak type man, but he said this meat and these onions shone the most at medium rare. He briefly heated up a jar of sauce, which was divine, and we sat in silence as I ate maybe the greatest dinner I've ever been served. "How was that as a last meal?" Donegan asked. His face was stony and serious, and I asked him to repeat what he'd said. I said, "How would that be as a last meal?" he said. But the smirk on his face let me know he knew exactly what he said originally. I told him it would be pretty much ideal as a last meal. Donegan laughed and said, thankfully it would be. I'd enjoyed plenty of great cuisine on my grand trip, and then, out of the blue, he asked if I'd been to the Blanglo State Forest. I said I hadn't, but it was on our bucket list. Donegan looked at me seriously and warned me to be careful, because the backpacker killer was still roaming that forest, looking for backpackers to kill. I pointed out that Ivan Milat had been arrested years ago, and funnily enough, he died a couple of years after this. Donegan just nodded thoughtfully but said nothing. Something told me that he either didn't believe Ivan Milat was the backpacker killer, he never officially confessed to anyone but his mother, or Donegan was trying to spook me by hinting that he was the killer. And then he asked me if I'd enjoyed the human meat I'd just consumed. By that point, I was getting wise to old Donnie's tricks. He wanted a reaction, so I gave him one. I jumped up in shock, shouting in horror, asking if he'd really fed me human meat. Donegan stared at me for what seemed like forever and then laughed. Without a word, he walked into the kitchen and came back out, hefting a cow carcass over his shoulder with cuts removed. "This was your dinner, pal," he said, and then dropped the carcass in one corner. "Now, time to sleep." And I had no choice, I figured. I lay on the guest mattress that Donegan offered me and tried to drift off, and somehow, briefly, I did. I don't know what woke me, but I woke with the knowledge that I absolutely had to leave immediately. The fire was still smoldering, and I could see that Donegan was not in his bed. It looked untouched. The cow carcass was also missing, and since I hadn't really brought any belongings with me to this Yoo-Hoo Rock, I figured that I could just duck out under cover of night. I'd rather freeze to death than face whatever weirdness Donegan had in store for me next, and as soon as he'd mentioned Ivan Milat, my hackles had already been raised. And so I snuck out of the cave and slid down the side. I made it quite some distance, and I thought that I had a good idea of the direction of the ute, and then I was stopped in my stride. Donegan stood there in the middle of the desert surrounded by what I can only assume dogs or dingoes. They'd clearly feasted on the remains of the cow carcass because bones lay picked clean on the ground. Donegan looked at me, and as one, so did all the dingoes, their eyes glowing in the moonlight reflected in their pupils, and I swear, Donegan's eyes glowed like those dingoes in that moment. The dingoes started growling and I saw their own hackles rise. Donegan commanded them to sit, and all 5 that I could see, without fail, obeyed him. Dingoes, wild animals, and if you don't know, dingoes aren't like dogs. They're majestic and beautiful creatures, but you really cannot tame them unless you've raised them since birth. "They obey my every word," Donegan said. "I could sick them on you if I wanted. They wouldn't leave me a scrap." I asked him to please not do that, and Donegan let out a laugh. "What do you think, boys?" And then he started asking me if I knew that dingoes once ate a baby, and I said of course, it was a very famous case, even if I wasn't born at the time. He told me that apparently fully grown humans are tastier to dingoes than babies, and I didn't want to know how he knew this, so I didn't ask. And then he told me that dingoes can outrun a man 3 times as fast. Again, I wasn't sure if this was true, so I kind of begged him not to force me to find out. Again, Donegan asked the dingoes if they thought that they should feed on me, and at this point I'm not ashamed to say that I pissed my own pants and pleaded with him not to hurt me, and to let me live. Donegan looked at me with disgust and said that I'd soiled myself now, and I was lucky because there was no way he was letting his beloved dingoes eat my piss-covered flesh. Instead, he walked away, commanding his beasts to heel, and I didn't know if I could trust him, but I took a gamble. And you know what? It turns out the ute was parked just behind the small rock Donegan had been standing near, and he'd left me a parting gift. The head of the cow we'd eaten just earlier and that the dingoes had feasted on was sitting on the windshield. I had to wash the blood off, leaving me even more paranoid that the other shoe was about to drop and I was about to be attacked. But thankfully no. Instead, I finally got the windscreen clean enough that I could see through and gunned the ute. I drove away, and I swear after 10 minutes of driving in the rearview mirror I could see a pack of dingoes running behind my car, their eyes shining in the darkness. When I reached our hostel, Malk had stopped vacating his bowels and his stomach was feeling a lot better, but when I told him the tale of Donegan and his dingoes, his face went whiter than I'd seen it when he was sick. He told me, and swears on his life that he wasn't winding me up, that he'd read about a man who was cursed to walk the central desert communing with the wildlife, and if you accepted his invitation to dine with him, he only let you leave if he deemed you worthy. I explained that he only let me leave because I pissed myself, and this left Malk a little less sure that I'd had a supernatural encounter. Needless to say, I went to the cops the next day and they reassured me that I very much had not encountered some supernatural spirit. Based on my description, what I'd encountered instead was a wanted fugitive who robbed a number of post offices at gunpoint in Alice Springs and the surrounding area. They'd been searching for him for a few years and had no idea that he'd been hiding out in a cave in what I called Yoo-Hoo Rock. We stuck around the area, forking out for a better hotel than what we were currently slumming in, and I'm glad we did. The cops managed to apprehend Donegan, who was indeed the armed robber that they were looking for. There was no sign of his tamed dingoes, and I'm glad of that. They were innocent, and I hope they went off to have exciting cow-hunting lives. But as for Donegan, you may be an a-hole who robs post offices at shotgun point, but you do cook a mean steak. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday and Thursday at 9 p.m. EST, and there are super fun live streams on Sundays and Wednesday nights. If you got a story, be sure to submit them over at my email at letsreadsubmissions@gmail.com and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks and bonus content for members of the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast where you can hear all of these stories and big compilations located anywhere you listen to podcasts. I also have a true crime channel called Saturn Soul. All links in the description below. Thanks so much, friends, and I'll see you again soon.